Camp Beta. This is episode number, Chris, you're going to have to help me. Are we on 106 now?
106. 106.
Okay. This is a routine we do almost every episode, Ron. We never know what number the episode is. I'm Sean.
And I'm Chris.
And today I'm overjoyed. So every episode of Base Camp Beta is its own little treasure, right? All of our guests are wonderful. But I'm particularly happy to have with us today Ron Kuivila. Ron, please say hi.
Hi, and thank you. Yeah.
Ron is someone very dear to me. He was my thesis advisor when I was working on my master's at Wesleyan. And so Ron has put up with me rambling about myself and my process and my bullshit to great lengths. So today we get to flip that script and let Ron take center stage. So yeah, let's jump in. Ron, we generally start with the kind of big overarching question of how our guests got into weird music and you know weird artistic practices of any sort. For yourself, this is something I'd want to linger on almost maybe a minute or two longer than we normally do, because you have a generational perspective that is pretty different from most of our guests who are, you know,
sure,
millennial to Gen X generally,
as opposed to old and in the way.
Right, but no, I mean, I'm particularly curious as to like how you came into weird music. The music industry looked really different back then. There was a very different scope of subcultural formations.
Oh yeah,
and so yeah, so it was a very different world. So I'm curious what your inroads were. I know in an interview you mentioned that you were aware of like Alvin Lucier before you wound up doing your undergraduate.
Yeah. I mean, I'll start with the prehistory here. So the prehistory let's
dig in.
Miss Gainey's music appreciation class in 8th grade, when she said, "Don't tell my supervisor I'm playing you this or I'll get in trouble." And she played some of Indeterminacy. And I was really struck by the fact that the change in tempo associated with each story, in order to have it take the same duration, had all this affective import, but that wasn't why it was there. And that disconnect is something that really stuck with me. Maybe almost as a theatrical idea. I mean, but it was like, it was something that was in the back of my mind. So that's like step one. Step two was a couple of years later, visiting, I can't remember the name of the city in upstate New York, where Hobart and William Smith College are, but visiting Steve Kuzisto, who's a friend of mine who had moved there. His dad had become president of the college. And he introduced me to Frank Zappa and played Hot Rats. And it was like, well, okay, Bully the Pimp, it's okay, but they're just jamming. But what's this Peaches on Regalia? And then when he was away through Find Uncle Meat, it's like, what the fuck? So that was a very powerful musical experience for me at that point.
I'm not familiar offhand with Peaches on Regalia.
Oh, it's just one of the songs. It's very arranged. It's a studio project. It's ironic, but very, very beautifully done. And similarly, so Uncle Meat, there's like the Uncle Meat theme is done many, many tracks, extremely beautifully orchestrated electronics. I mean, organ and this and that. A lot of speed change of instruments. So the singer, you never really hear his real voice, but and there's a bunch of junk in that double record set, but it's actually very good and it's worth checking out. I mean, for example, the Air, which is sort of a parody of doo-wop with a whole theme of sexual violence that's fantastically, beautifully hideous. It's really, it's quite amazing. And that work went straight downhill after, I don't know, 1973 or something. But up until then, it was very interesting. Anyway, so at the same time then, I started going to the free music store at SUNY at Albany that Joel Chadaby ran, because I was getting interested in synthesizers and like trying to figure stuff out. So there were these electronic music concerts. And let's see, I heard Gordon Muma and David Behrman first, then Namjoon Pike came up to show what essentially Rush's, like brand new recordings he had made working on the tribute to John Cage. And part of that was this interview with Alvin, where he's not only not trying to control his stutter, he's trying to activate it. And the interviewer is not in on the joke. And the raw material was really astounding in that he was going for it. So he'd hold an S sound for like several minutes. And, you'd see muscular fatigue in his face. It was like scary. And at first I was kind of like feeling, sort of concerned for him, let's say, as this person, like what's going on, not really quite getting it. And some people started laughing. I thought that's incredibly rude. And then he comes out with the line, well, the Woodstock of real historic importance wasn't the Woodstock with 500,000 human beings in the mud, but rather the Woodstock of 1952, when 4 minutes and 33 seconds was first performed. So this is like, oh my God, okay, this is totally great. And part of what really interested me with it was, so it also, the year before, run into Gertrude Stein's writing, which I was interested in. And I thought, well, but and part of the thing that interests me with that is it's like Prattle. And Prattle, I think, always has an element of sublimated rage. Like in the case of Prattle, it's like just generating this endless stream of trivial talk. But in the case of Gertrude Stein, it's like complete control of how meaning is slowly emerging in this repeating word salad. I actually think, by the way, just as an aside, I think you can make an association between that property and Éliane Radigue's electronic pieces, which have the same property of they seem very
oceanic
still,
immersion,
but they're relentlessly moving forward. And then the other thing, I mean, just to finish that aside, is the thing that's super interesting about that work of Éliane Radigue's is it's completely influenced by the objets sonores Pierre Schaeffer, like classic musique concrète, even though it sounds like American minimalism. It's not that at all, actually,
right?
Which is kind of cool. I mean, it's a very interesting aspect of it. Anyway, okay, so back to this. So, and my thought back to Alvin during this interview is, well, this is almost, even though it's clearly a goof, it's almost better than Gertrude Stein, because here I've got this totally affective thing, stuttering. It's happening, but all of the concern about it is pushed aside by how it's being deployed. That you are using your infirmity directly, taking it, and in a sense embracing it and taking advantage of it. Almost has a processor modulator, right?
Right.
And that really was like, oh, I got to get to the bottom of this. And that was kind of what, I was already, I can't remember now exactly when I saw that in relation to applying to go to school at Wesleyan, because part of that was also seeing like these jazz luminaries, Jimmy Garrison, teaching bass. It's like, what's this? And the world music program. Because at the same time, okay, I'm playing in a band, doing this and that, interested in jazz, in part because I was sort of interested in it, like, well, because this seems like a more developed music, what is going on? And there was this Albany Jazz Society, and they had a concert in Albany. There's the what's called the Egg, which is part of this New York State campus. Very nice 7-foot handmade Yamaha grand piano. Anyway, the Creative Music Studio was just opening up in Woodstock. So David Holland came up and played with a local pianist named Lee Shaw. And it was stunning. Lee Shaw is kind of small woman, very strong, kind of bassy beat feel, a complete harmonic encyclopedia, like an amazing harmonic mind. And so they were doing a free duo. Holland would do something and she would rationalize it. It was sort of like no matter what he threw at her, she would like kind of be staying in her harmonic language. And you could see he was having, he was really into it, like we're having more and more fun with this discovery. And there was this definite dialogue back and forth going on. And finally it got to a point where she played a cluster. And there was like this orgasmic sound from the audience, right? And okay, the set ended. It's an intermission. Holland comes out again and is trying to get her back on stage, and she won't go. because she's horrified that she played a cluster. Anyway, so the result of that was like I went and I said, I have to have some piano lessons with this woman. I mean, this is amazing. Okay. And
yeah, I was going to ask what your kind of like personal instrumental practice was up until this point.
I was a keyboard player. Yeah. Okay. I mean, like, you know, in elementary school, I played violin for a year, didn't really take to it, played flute for a year, kind of enjoyed it, but didn't. And then sort of left that for about 2 years. Actually, yeah, the thing that got me back into music was hearing records coming out of my brother's room. It's like, oh, okay. Music, you know. But then it was sort of, that was actually almost concurrent with the cage, like sort of probably in 8th grade. Okay. Anyway, and so another influence at that point was like the first Mahavishnu Orchestra album, like kind of what was going on at the Creative Music Studio. So there was that kind of conflation, but you know, kind of the way that all went, to my mind, sour really quickly. Like in the case of Mahavishnu Orchestra, the moment Jan Hammer got a mini Moog, that was the end. It's just like It just sucked. I mean, because you didn't need another voice like that. And the ring modulated Fender Rhodes was fantastic. And also it kept it within, it kept it having more of a relationship to jazz rather than just diving straight into, you know, kind of hyper fast acid rock, or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And I kind of totally lost interest.
So I guess to zoom back and kind of frame this a little more clearly. So you're kind of like primordial musical background was one that was rooted in some of the more experimental jazz of the moment, the still sort of codifying American experimental tradition.
Yeah, I was hitting that. Good.
And then some elements of kind of like more counterculturally rooted stuff with like the Zappa.
Yeah. I mean, rock and roll in various forms. Also, I mean, you got to understand. I mean, one thing about that moment is there was a bizarre level of cultural activity. So, for example, I grew up in a town called Glenmont that was part of a larger conglomeration called Bethlehem, and there was a town called Delmar that had a community center that became a youth center. And it wasn't really doing anything. And then a classmate of mine, Kathy Barber, started booking shows from the kind of folk circuit of Cafe Lena. Okay. So that thing was happening there. And, you know, so say within that range of things, hearing somebody like Dave Bromberg, a kind of ironic voice within that world, was fresh.
Okay.
Right. So you're taking in, you know, it's like, you don't know, you're just taking in all these different music cultures, you know. Right. There was here's a great story. There was a concert of the Albany Symphony together with the Mahavishnu Orchestra at SUNY Albany that I took my dad to, who fell asleep probably because of all the pot being smoked around him. He loved music. And there was this little scandal because there was an allegation that McLaughlin had been invited to do a collaboration with the Albany Symphony, which never happened. And he said, he would have loved to do that. So he kind of called them out. It was funny.
That's great. But so, yeah, to continue sort of framing this background, then there is the sort of literary aspect to it too, with you mentioned Stein and also in a sense, this performance of Lucier's.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that side of things, you know, sort of like first year at Wesleyan, I was reading a lot of books while not taking any English courses. So it's kind of like Gravity's Rainbow was a big deal for me at that point. And, you know, so right, you're just kind of drawing on all these different cultural forms.
Right.
What I didn't really have any particular knowledge of is contemporary art, visual art practices. That I kind of learned by osmosis after getting to Wesleyan. You know, so it's very much kind of, it's what would come out of these music venues, which would include Namjoon Pike. So you're getting it in some way. And so then when I went to Wesleyan, it was the first year of the Center for the Arts. And so the cute story is Alvin had Charlotte Moorman perform in the Zilka Gallery. And before that, some situation, so I started asking her about the Namjoon Pike video, which she plays a prominent role in, and how she felt about it, and . And then I asked her, you know, well, how do you have the courage to do these pieces. The famous opera sexphonique where she gets arrested. She said, "Well, aren't you sweet? You just got yourself the opportunity to help me wear the video brassiere." And then the other person was Kit Lines, who's an interesting musician who was maybe a junior or senior, and also obviously gay. So it's like this little nervous freshman and the gay guy. So she had it under control, right? Nevertheless, when it came to apply the video brassiere, she said, "Don't touch me, boys, or we'll all get arrested."
That's nice.
Then with the video brassiere on, she starts changing the channel. Says, "Oh, I got 2 baseball games." And then she has a magnet on her hand, and so just deflecting the video as she plays. It was very charming.
So yeah, let's take half a step backwards.
Yeah.
So you did your undergraduate work at Wesleyan, which we started tucking into a little bit. One big question I had about your time at Wesleyan was, here I believe you met Lucier, of course, who you continued to work with throughout the rest of his life, and then Nicolas Collins as well. You met at
Nick Collins. I met during freshman orientation. He was around. That's where we immediately talking. And we ended up splitting an apartment for 2 years, my sophomore and junior year. But he was the TA for the class, and so he had some authority.
Okay.
Yeah, no, and then it all developed. But also within that, there were graduate students coming in also. So Mark Graff was an excellent flautist and had been at Mills, and Greg Howard is Australian, and Mark Graff played a huge role because so he and Nick kind of got WSA money, and he would bring in all the people. As a grad student, he was doing an evening seminar, and would bring in basically all these people who were coming from Mills who moved to New York. So Peter Gordon, Joe Crozen, Beth Anderson, and so forth. So we were getting contact with that whole scene as it was just forming.
Got it.
And so that, and that, of course, is very lively just to see kind of people in the middle of making it. And so, I remember going to hear Peter Gordon play in just some loft somewhere, and he was very excited that Phil Glass had showed up, hoping he'd get a gig with the Phil Glass Ensemble.
That's understandable.
Yeah. And let me say that, so at that point, while I was undergraduate, there was a steady passage back and forth into New York, not my freshman year, not my sophomore year, but junior and senior year, absolutely. And right. So, so we're talking about 75 to 77 as far as when I'm an undergraduate. And so that's an extremely lively time in New York. And I went to a lot of stuff. So before PS1 opened, Alana Heiss had this project which she called the Idea Warehouse. And one of the things is the Phil Glass Ensemble did open rehearsals there, six times over the spring. And I went to one of those, and I think they were working on music in changing parts, but I don't really remember exactly. But they got, about an hour into it, and it was a total train wreck. Beautiful, but no, it was a mess. And so he just stopped and said, "Guess what? You're going to get a whole second concert." And they started it over. And people stayed, yeah.
That's fantastic. So I guess to kind of wrap up the kind of Wesleyan, the part of the Wesleyan story. What were your studies there like, and what were your particular technical concerns and kind of aesthetic preoccupations?
Well, okay, so actually to really explain it would go like this. Nick and I started working on doing circuits. There was a guy named Bob White who had the lab who prepared stuff, but he let us just kind of live in there. And so I made a piece that was based on the idea of switching 2 different sounds whenever the waveforms were going in the same direction at almost the same rate. So the idea is like if you tune an interval, that would happen. So I breadboarded this thing, and and we didn't know what we were doing really. I was just sort of doing it piece by piece, but it's possible to assemble it all. Kind of made it work, and that was great. Then my junior year, a friend of mine up in Albany, I think, showed me this named John Jameson, who's a photographer. Actually played bass also, but this sort of broadside from this place called ZBS advertising a kind of artist residency. So Nick and I both applied. I said, okay, well, you two can do it together. So we're up there for a week. And I'd had this idea about making I was very interested in basically a very simple idea, which is you'd have something like a heat sink with a solenoid so it would ring like a gong. But it happens at Wesleyan, there's this building, the music department building has a pass-through. And so there's like a hole in the middle of the building that the sidewalk runs through. What I want to do is mount this in there and have it sound only when someone had left and no one else was entering. So it'd always be behind you, right? It'd be this thing that happened. And so thinking about that, I looked into ultrasonic burglar alarms. So then we're up at ZBS. We've done a whole bunch of projects. So towards the end, I said, Bob, so Bob Bilecki, we have to mention Bob Bilecki, who's an amazing human being, total sweetheart, and great ears, and, is responsible for an enormous amount of technology that went into downtown arts projects in the 70s and 80s, for sure, and yes. Throughout. He's associated with everybody at one point or another. And so we sat down to do this and he had a piezo thing, and we got sound, and so we could see the waveform. And I noticed that when you moved, so there's a transmitter and a microphone, you'd see a beating pattern. I said, that beating pattern, isn't that at audio rate? He said, yeah. I said, well, can we extract that? So I made a little, amplitude follower, and then heard, like the kind of the sound of that sound. And that became the basis of a whole bunch of work I did there and then at Mills. And that went on for, I'd say maybe 7 years, certainly maybe 8 years, that I was making pieces using ultrasound in different ways, like a feedback loop so you could transduce a flame because the flame would modulate the feedback, things with moving sources, like antennas spinning around, transmitting the ultrasound, a whole bunch of different projects. And so basically, after that residency, I was working on that in various ways, trying to refine the sound, lessen the noise, do all sorts of things. And I kind of got, and went through several generations of design. Not, let me say, this is all kind of seat of the pants. Understanding some principles, but not knowing, not having any serious electronics training except what you get from a cookbook. That was always DIY. So that was that was the culmination of the Wesleyan thing. I should mention also, in that time, I played shakuhachi, Japanese handbone flute, and in particular the first year, I studied with this completely amazing player named Yoshikazu Iwamoto. And that was fantastic in that I could go, he started calling me Columbo because I would come into classes, I would come to a lesson, and at the end of the lesson, I'd have a specific question, like one
more thing,
one really particular question, and there was always about so I was trying to get physical with the instrument, right? And so you're blowing hard, and so it just turns out that in order to make pitches be reliable, there's all these little half-stop tricks. Just raise this finger a little bit, and boom, and the pitch locks in. So he would tell me that. I would go off and woodshed for, the week. And so by the end of that year, I could actually play the instrument. I was getting a good sound, and I played Shikano Tone, which is kind of a famous Hankyoku piece. It's a duet with a guy, Ollie Griffith, who's a jazz saxophonist, and that was good. And that was actually pretty important experience in that it's complementary to the electronics. It's very tactile, but you're also very much in the sound, so it's very related. And so that kind of that was kind of my world music thing. Like I never played in the gamelan, although I knew a million people who did, of course. But that was, and so I would. Then he left, and I would go. And also, I have to mention Namino Tori, who was sort of ran that program. This amazing koto shamisen vocalist, vocalist. And I would go to Sankyoku ensemble classes on Friday afternoons, go on for 3 hours and just stay, kind of immersing in that music. So that was a thing. There's never an idea in my mind of a direct integration or connection. It was more like I was experiencing a different way music could be. And I'd say like my whole view of Wesleyan then and to this day, right, is that to my mind is the deep project of that whole department, is that it's just founded on the idea that you want to encounter as many different ways music can be as you can. That if you do that frees you. And
right.
Other people would have the goal of like becoming, like a great maven of a particular tradition. But to me, that seemed colonizing.
Right. So this was less of a kind of directly synthetic project in your mind as far as kind of reconciling these two.
No, it's music education.
Different. Right.
It's ear training.
It's more just sort of equipping you with different kind of methodological lenses.
Yeah, exactly. Just a different way of hearing. Like, so for example, like one of the things you learn there is, so you're doing one of these big pieces, and now shamisen is pure attack. I mean, right, it's less sustained than a banjo, right? And then you're having a deceleration, and nobody's leading it, you're just doing it. So there's no way you're going to be perfectly simultaneous. There's no, so I refer to it as the beauty of the flam, right? But that is not a sound you encounter.
Right, yeah.
And any other music that I was hearing at the time, right? And that idea, like, oh no, it doesn't have to be synchronous. That you can have a heterophony that's also, it's because the way in which you find that is with a groove, but this is not really in a groove at that point. So it's a heterophony without a groove, exactly. So that for me was pretty interesting. Like, oh, that's different, and that's kind of what I was always looking for, was finding that kind of an experience where you have to like get past you have an initial rejection even, and you get past that to recognize what it's actually giving you. And that I think is a huge, that is an acquired skill. I don't think it happens natively.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that also is sort of baked into the modernist project at large, which is something that has been sort of forgotten.
Well, certainly. Okay, so surrealism and anthropology have a very strong social connection in France.
Yes.
So, I mean, absolutely. And of course, it is like, that's like the other side of this course, because that also totally has to do with empire.
Yes.
I mean, so like, maybe it's Jugendstil. I can't think of the name of but the very elaborate linear design patterns that are almost prefigure like sort of psychedelia of the late 60s. That is all coming out of looking for the source of the Congo River.
Okay.
That was like there's deep connection, and was coming out of Belgium. So you have that. Then you've got, say, at the time I'm at Wesleyan, in a way you can think of it, it's a reflection of Pax Americana.
Yes.
And the department itself goes through the recognition, of all of those complexities, and goes through a whole series of transformations over time as it tries to resolve them in its way. Yeah.
This is sort of the shift from so-called world music to eventually ethnomusicology.
No, not exactly. I mean, that's a kind of internal disciplinary thing. It's more what the position of an artist in residence is.
Okay.
Right.
I mean, my understanding is that the shift to ethnomusicology is one that incorporated a sort of element of autocritique.
Yes. That's absolutely true. And certainly maybe it's like, like the reflexive move doesn't come in until, the late 80s, right, in ethnomusicology. So at that point, yes, that's all kind of understood. But it's happening in other ways simply through the social connection. So Doug Knight, who is a very good Mardungam player, who's married to the daughter of Bala Saraswati, had the story of, he said, we're students, we're studying, and then Ranga's kids and Tori's kids, I think, came in and played and like tore it down. So like the 12-year-old children of the artists in residence came in, and they were playing not their parents' music and killing it. Was his story,
right?
So you'd have things like that reveal it. There's a very interesting figure that nobody's ever written about, and I'm not sure how you'd find out a lot about Doogie Mitchell, who's a Navajo a Blessing Way singer, who is the son of Frank Mitchell, and David McAllister, who's at ethnomusicology there, Charlotte Frisbee, that's her name, worked together on a translation of an autobiography that he gave simply talking to a tape recorder near the end of his life, which took them about 10 years to finish because they had to get family approval. Anyway, so he was son of Frank Mitchell, Doogie. He was very close with Alvin. He was completely out. He would cruise the workmen building the Center for the Arts. And the legend I heard from another person there was that after he essentially drank himself to death. It's tragic, right? David Reck, a bunch of people wrote pieces dedicated to him or for him. So he had this huge impact at the time. And the legend was that there was a wake after his passing where the entire trans community came out. So it was like, and it was a big deal. It was like the first time there'd be an event of that sort. And that must have been in 1972, something like that, before I was there. This is all stuff I only know as in legend and song. But that kind of captures some of the flavor of that time in the department. Like also, you had like, for example, John McLaughlin coming up to take vina lessons. Nick has the story of having McLaughlin sleep on his floor in his fraternity. It's also to capture how the boundaries between these figures who are cultural, have they have a certain iconicity already, and just like some nerdy kid was not very big at that moment. 10 years later, it'll be a totally different story. So, there's just, it's kind of like an amazing mayhem. And that, and that was also very true in New York. Where you go to Magoo's and you see everybody.
I think that is something that has in a lot of ways just stayed true throughout New York sub and counterculture, in the intervening half decade. That's one of the real joys of being in New York, is that it collapses a lot of those distances.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. Particularly when you've got like weird little venues.
Yeah.
Because you go to a weird little venue and there's maybe 15 people there, and 3 of them are like, "Oh my God, he's here."
Yeah. You gestured towards your time at Mills a little bit already. Yeah. Is there anything else you want to talk about with your Mills time?
The Mills time was totally ecstatic. It was a wonderful, wonderful time. It's a fantastic group of people. Fast forward, Rich Gold, Joel Ryan, Frankie Mann. These are all amazing creative minds and musicians, different ways. Also, this is when I took a class with Ron Nagel, sculptor, songwriter, you might know, ceramicist. He wrote the song "Don't Touch Me There."
Okay.
Funny thing is, so I get there, and I wander around a bit. I'm thinking, like, why are these people so happy? And it took me about 3 months to realize, oh, fuck, this is like the high point of Harvey Milk. Just before he's killed. And it's like, people are out. And I totally don't get it. I'm like totally naive. And it's like, oh, I finally actually figured it out. I go into a bar in San Francisco and I say, wait a minute, I'm getting eyed by everybody, the men and the women. What the fuck is going on here? I said, oh, I get it. This is good for me. I'm straight. oh, I mean, women will talk to me. Cool. Right. I mean, it's a little bit of that.
Right.
And it was also, technologically speaking, there's a lot going on. So, and at Mills, Blue Jean Tyranny, I've incredible conversations with him. Paul Dominguez is around. It's between Behrman and Ashley. So you kind of have these two different things happening there. There were, Don Day is teaching video up at California College of Arts and Crafts. He went on to collaborate with the inventor of PostScript on doing an initial set of fonts, who is like an old friend of his. And so, they're just like, and 80 Langdon Street is rolling. Little initiatives would happen. There was this guy now, I think it was Irv Denman, but I'm not clear on this. But anyway, he bought the old Blind Lemon, which is a blues club, and was turned into like a new music venue. It's like painted purple, very, but it's very funny. The opening of it had like an opening party. And the woman who runs Mr. Majors, which is a serious blues club in Oakland, came to check it out. Not sure, like, oh, are we going to have a problem here? No, this is all fine. And then she and Frankie started flirting, doing a little Tai Chi number. Frankie was like, oh, it was beautiful, right? I mean, so those kinds of things are, that was a great time. But what happened was I got a job working for Bob Malecki at ZBS. Right. So I went back for that. It's kind of there are a couple of different things. I did that. Then I had a little gig. There was a sound show that an institution that no longer exists, Leica, had organized in LA that moved to PS1. I actually had a piece in that show, which is called Musical Chameleon. The idea was, it's the opposite. Like when you approach it, it falls silent. And so I made that for there, but then it came back and it had been damaged. So I was rebuilding it. And I thought, oh, you know what? All I have to do is do this, this, and this. And now half the time it will do that. And half the time it will just trigger when you get near it. But I'll leave the sign up for the original piece. So half the time it's lying, right? So while I'm at Mills, I'd applied for what's called a CAPS grant in New York State through my parents' address in Albany, which I didn't get. But then I'm home for Christmas and the phone rings. Pick up the phone, say, hello, may I speak to Ron Kuivila, please? This is he. This is David Tudor. I was like, what? And what it turned out, he had been on the panel. He saw the application. And based on that, I got an invitation to do a couple of studio events for the Cunningham Company. They were doing younger composers. Nick did this as well. A bunch of people. And they did this over a couple of months. And so that was like this kind of thrilling event. But it meant that Cage, who I'd already had conversations with at June in Buffalo back when I was an undergraduate, but he sort of knew who I was. So he came up to me and said, I think your piece is broken. And I said, well, why? And he explained. I said, oh, well, and I explained, and he gave me like a big, beautiful Cage smile and disappeared.
I guess the quick gestures towards two things. One, this brings up the kind of role of sabotage in your work.
Sure.
And then two, what your relationship to Tudor's work was up until this point.
Oh, I see. Well, I didn't really have that much relationship to Tudor's work at that point. I mean, I had heard he had come also and done microphone from tapes, but I wasn't wild about that piece. I mean, I was a little disappointed, actually. I had heard Composers Inside Electronics at the Kitchen and heard Pulsars, which is wonderful. And so, but there's a way in which he remained a mystery to me because there's all this evidence of his significance, but there was no way to get direct contact. Like this is the thing David Grubbs in, that book, Recording Ruins the Landscape, he talks about, and which I think is it's a very good point about changing periods. Like, okay, in the, 60s, 70s, and the 80s, getting your hands on weird stuff took work. It was hard to do. Right. In New York, there was the Jazz Composers Orchestra Association. You could go there. Everybody had their records there. but so there were ways, but it was tough. So you'd hear a lot and kind of imagine a lot, and that's actually kind of great because it invites new activity by yourself because you can't find it. And of course, now we can know everything, and that's an entirely different relationship.
Right. I mean, this is something that we've discussed at reasonable length on this podcast. I mean, I experienced that in even this somewhat an attenuated form in my youth. Just like, it was hard to find out about music, and it was hard to find it.
Right.
So you might spend years trying to track down a single record, and that did open up a whole kind of a wonderful imaginary space.
Yeah, I mean, I remember sending a little letter to I can't even remember, but basically to the Sun Ra label, Saturn Records in Philadelphia. And then getting back like a little printed thing. Yeah, it's just craziness.
Right.
And that's also why, I mean, I think because those communication channels weren't fully constructed, that also is part of what made it so porous.
Right.
Like, because you wouldn't know what was going to lead to something.
Right. Well, yeah. Genre distinctions were a little looser, and you might wind up getting deep into a genre hole that you weren't expecting.
Well, and people are making it on their own. I mean, like, just as an example, back to Creative Music Studio, the image of all the musicians, including Chick Corea, helping raise the piano to get it on stage. Think of that. That would never happen today.
No.
Liability concern alone.
Well, so I feel like this dovetails nicely into the next little segment here, where I just want to talk about your recorded output, which is relatively scant, but is interesting. Yeah, no. It's, I mean, so there's two albums which you did on Lovely Music.
Right.
The one that's a split with Nick Collins,
right,
and then a solo cassette, Blurred Genres, which is for a dance piece by Susan Foster.
Yeah, and
then there's a handful of like kind of one-off compilation appearances. So, I wanted to just touch on each of those, maybe somewhat briefly. But I wanted to note, like, it's a little hard to situate them in terms of the kind of like sonic landscape of the time. That they like, it strikes me that there are some ties to kind of Sonic Arts Union spiritually, and some ties to Tudor, perhaps, with this very unhinged energy. But they seem to brush against some of what I'd identify as the kind of dominant kind of avant-garde trends of the time in America. And there seems to be more ties to my ears to even like facets of like European underground industrial music and cassette trading culture.
I understand what you're hearing there. That wasn't happening in my mind at the point. I was just doing what I was doing.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I thought of myself as, too young for the orphanage, too old for the folks' home. It just didn't fit. It just didn't fit. Like so. For example, what I was initially really interested in is just this idea of, in a sense, complete conceptual integration. So that is kind of coming out of the language around, particularly Behrman and Muma, the circuit has embodying a potential that defines a piece, right?
Okay.
So there's some of that is going on there. Part of it is also I got very interested in sound installations. And so sound installations, I never found a way to publish. And part of my interest in sound installations was the challenge of making them sticky, that people would actually stay. And we can come back to that, but back to the recordings. So
first we have the split with Nick Collins going out with Slow Smoke.
Yeah. So that already, that's sort of the single board micro era. And so I'd add this, the idea of that, an opening idea of first circuit of switching based on derivative and value. That was stretching out sound. One of the pieces based on stretching out sounds based on the same principle, where you'd loop a segment and then move on to the next segment. And so, but the control for that was extremely primitive. I had like basically 8 little keys that I could use to set thresholds live. And I kind of work with the sound because you load sound in the processor. There's no easy way to like store things into a file. So there's no notion of presets. It's good old fashioned live electronics, but with a digital thing. And and that became an overdubbing project, which is also pretty typical of the time, to kind of get that sound happening. At the same time,
and this is the first piece on it, the slow smoke piece.
Yeah, the slow smoke piece.
Yeah, the alphabet piece. I know you've
alphabet piece is entirely different. So what happened?
Right.
So I did that. Then I wanted to but I was very interested in trying to process sound directly this way. So I worked out there was a direct memory access chip, so a controller that would automatically read that had multiple channels, but it had to work with a Z80 where the SIM1 card I had was 6502. So I was in Buffalo at that point doing an artist in residency through media study. That's a whole other story that it's very interesting we could get into. But so I talked to somebody. So the Center for Media Study had all these film, Paul Sheretz is there and Hollis Frampton. So I ended up buying this card from Hollis Frampton to build the circuit from, which he had used to build a prototype for a computer-controlled light gun to realize Paul Sheretz's films.
Okay.
Anyway, and so that board is it, and so basically the way that worked was it would record. One clock would control how quickly it was recording into this 16K of memory, which is a large card, S100 card that would fit vertically, the thing. And two other oscillators would control how fast it played back. And I performed it using first two Casio VL tones, and I moved up to the MT30. So with Alphabet, what happens there is record that sound, live recording, nothing stored, Alphabet, and then worked out this little piece, which is kind of like a faux modal piece. Then it gets to a point, and then open the delay, so that starts to degenerate and become a reverberant place. Then I'm actually using the Casio to play these kind of pitch variations. I mean, basically the same pitch material, but made a little bit florid, the little delay gets a little mushy, and then what I'm very proud of though is the conclusion of that is basically that pitch phrase inverted during the harmonization, and what happens is it means that it ends on a descending diminished chord because it's a minor third. And so that was I remember a student of Alvin's, Myrna Schloss, said, "Well, Ron, you're an old-fashioned composer." Piece. Yeah.
Was that stumbled upon sort of by chance, or was that kind of worked out in advance?
Well, I mean, it's worked out. It's worked out interactively with the system. You can't.
Right.
I mean, those things. There's no way you can conceive it and have any guarantee it's going to happen.
Right.
And then the middle piece is actually using ultrasound as well as that, which is kind of a bigger, longer, dronier piece.
Yeah.
Then the next record, let me think. There's a keyboard study, which is the idea there is it's that same device, but now what it's doing is it's playing back twice as fast as it records. And so
this is the Fidelity release.
Yeah, Fidelity. And so that keyboard study, which is the first thing on that record, is actually the VL tone again, has a little drum box going through, but it starts. Actually, there's a great review. Rolnick, Neil Rolnick, right? It's terrible that I'm blanking on his name. Wrote, said, "What does it mean when you put on a record and you immediately jump up to make sure that the needle isn't broken?" Which is that opening.
That's a high honor.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good review.
But those were working the same basic processes, which are you're sort of have a delay line which can harmonize and also be only slightly detuned, and so you're kind of moving around so that you don't hear the arpeggiation. Rather you hear the sound. So, it's a hiding. There's a fantastic free improvising cellist who passed away young, unfortunately, Tom Cora, who I had great respect for because you'd hear him play and he'd have a half dozen pedals. You never heard a pedal for longer than 4 seconds. it'd be constantly switching. So you never got comfortable. It's really beautiful playing. And so that's a little bit the issue with that and defining those tunings. Now, I think that I'm trying to remember all the pieces on that record. So that
There's the
keyboard study.
There is the lovely TI intends to.
Oh yeah,
Title.
So to TI intends to enforce its intellectual property rights to the fullest extent permitted by law, which I love. It's like, we just want to kill you. And actually, it's funny because that I'm thinking about. I'm just starting to investigate, kind of simulating the 5220 TI chip, which it turns out there's a whole culture that did this, which I was unaware of.
Right.
And kind of working with the lattice filters again, because the sounds of that are great, and it's really not nobody further developed it. I thought somebody would have chops and do it, and so now it's easier to do. So I'll go back to it. So
I mean, for audience clarification, like this was a piece that was built around abusing the TI speech synthesis circuits.
Yeah, so you got that chip, and it has a prom with a vocabulary, and then you could get it to misread the prom, and then kind of harvest from that these sounds, and then kind of develop the piece that way. So there's another piece called the Linear Predictive Zoo, which is on a roulette cassette, I think, something like that, which further develops that. But that's kind of as far as I got with it. Then I was moving on to other things. I mean, I got very involved in a kind of music software project with my friend Dave Anderson, forth-based language called Formula. But anyway, back to this piece. There are various issues with making it work. Like one thing you'll notice is about 2/3 of the way through, you suddenly get AM, PM, o'clock. So it's a totally just a basic musical problem of it needed a shift, and so it's a shift to begin to provide ictus, so that then it gets to the end. The time is o'clock. Right? It's o'clock, but o'clock. With sort of how that worked. So the language thing was actually important to how to make the piece work, even though the language thing is there to be destabilized. Actually, it's also true of alphabet. The reason why I use the word alphabet is I was thinking of Jasper Johns and the idea of like where the alphabet is a grid upon which the paint you discover all this painterly beauty in all those pieces that are alphabets. And so here it's like a meta version, because and it's the word, and then it's the processing of the word. And so that idea, I mean, let me just say that idea, because you were sort of touching on this much earlier on, of how the piece induces a kind of reflexive consideration for the listener, or how I imagine it in that way. That's something that is a frequent characteristic of the installations and those pieces, like that you get them when you notice they're either talking about themselves or talking about your relation to them. So there's this piece much later on, an installation piece called Der Schnuffelstaat, the nosy state, which the title comes from there was a Swiss protest when they discovered the Swiss government was basically keeping records on everybody. And this was right at the time of the first Iraq War.
Okay.
And so I had a cheap video converter on a Mac 2 that could do 160 by 120 pixels. And so the idea is this camera's overhead, black and white, looks just like those smart bomb images, really. But it had all these tiny little Swiss flags running a flocking algorithm. So as you moved your hand, you could gather the Swiss flags together. And so the thing is, what you're gathering, the cross is like a target. So it's like you're targeting yourself. So the idea of the installation was you would come in and you would see people involved in that interaction during what I referred to at the time as the invasion of the body snatchers mambo. It's like kind of you're doing this kind of a thing, right? Kind of disembodied because your attention is on that screen. So you see that first, and it's kind of hideous, right? And then you go in and can allow yourself to be seduced or not. So pieces like that, they're trying to work in a way that's triggering a consideration of the situation as well as a consideration of the activity that defines the situation. And so that's the kind of thing where when you do it in installation, it's all about the attention of the friendly receiver. If you do that in a performance, it often becomes about the performer controlling the audience. Like, it's a little bit of the problem of Laurie Anderson. And that's why I moved to installations. It's like I could do it there and not run into those kinds of social political dynamics. Anyway, that was a long aside. But I mean, I think it matters because that's all. I mean, so back to Fast Feet, Slow Smoke, of course, that's all radio announcer speech. And so it's all about the over-enunciation that was particularly characteristic at that time. So, they end up having these different placements. And so that's TIN10s.
Well, so there's also the Blurred Genres cassette.
Oh, yeah.
Which I'd love to quote your own words on it, which are on the Discogs page. Yeah. You write, Blurred Genres is a cycle of pieces composed for the dance by Susan Foster. The pieces are all concerned with either just tuning systems or polyphony with complex, oftentimes unpitched timbres. Stylistically, the first, third, and fifth pieces are devoted to the sustained, unfolding sonorities only possible with electronic sound, while the others subject various musical conventions to stylistic abuse. It's a wonderful piece of prose that says as much about you as the music does, I think. So,
right.
So yeah, if you want to talk a little bit about this one.
Well, it's funny. It's the one that one thing that's going on with those, that's actually that moves into formula. So let me do a run jump on it for the birth of formula. So what happened was, I was doing installations and pieces with a Mountain Hardware card and an Apple II computer. Mountain Hardware card was an 8-channel digital oscillator with a 256 sample waveform buffer. And what I realized was, so it would sound like shit because there's no interpolation, and you have 16 bits. So basically, what it'd be is you have an integer stepping size, so it could go through each sample, every other sample, every third, blah blah blah, and a fractional part. But the fractional part would just cause it to stutter step. So what I realized is that, but wait a minute, this is actually in just intonation. So if I have if you think of it in hexadecimal, so you have from 0 to FF. So 100 is 1 with 0 increment. 1.8 is 1.5 in hexadecimal, so to speak. And what I realized is the distortion components increase as you start expanding downwards. And what you're doing there is you've got the fifth, then C and 4 would be the just third and the just 7 and so forth. And so I basically did all the tunings based on that. And it's kind of cute. What actually got me thinking about that was that Arnold Dreiblatt had played for me a recording of Tony Conrad talking about his binary notation of the harmonic series, which is the basis of some of his Flickr films. So it was like this very funny circumnavigation that got me to figuring that out about the material. So that, and later on, I got one of those. David Reyna made this card that actually Lamont Young used quite a lot. A much larger version, larger waveform buffers. I used that for some pieces after that. And Blurred Genres used a bunch of that. And so now we'll get to formula. And formula was crucial to that. And what happened was, so I was using fourth to control these things, but everything is kind of monophonic. I went out to see my friend Dave, who'd Bob come in. It turned out he was doing things with a Mountain Hardware card in the same micro motion fourth was the fourth at the time. So we should try working together. So I went out. He was in Wisconsin at that point, doing a math or computer science PhD, and he had built with a friend a 6809 processor, and he had this fourth for it. So we'll get that and say, and in fourth there's this idea of the outer interpreter, which is the thing you interact with, and the inner interpreter that does stuff. Say, is there any way you could have the outer interpreter continue to run while it's running code? And he looks at, well, yeah. So he coded that. I mean, he's a brilliant programmer. And then suddenly you have an interactive situation. It's like you give it an instruction, you can give it another instruction. Right? And somebody, I think Doug Collins, a Canadian guy, had an idea of scheduled function call prior to this, but I'm not sure, called Moxie. But it could be that this was the first live coding environment.
Okay.
Who knows? Somebody was made that claim to me, and I thought, well, that's cute, but it doesn't really mean anything. But anyway, that then gave birth to that whole project of developing a music language in Forth. And so we worked on that because of Dave's brilliance. That had really, really excellent tight timing. And so actually the very first version of George Lewis's Voyager was done in Formula. And it was only because that project kind of died when he went back to the piece that he had to move it to Max.
Right.
So that was
so I guess in this era was Max on your radar?
Not well. Max didn't exist when we started this.
Max started, I thought, in the mid-late 80s.
That's right. But this started, let me think about it for a second, in 1985. So they're roughly concurrent. I became aware of it. Because Miller Puckett was at IRCAM at that point, and basically it was David Wessel, kind of protected that project from abuse by the others at IRCAM.
Right.
But I never really... I've done things with Max, absolutely. But to me, the static graph, particularly if you're thinking about a control structure, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I prefer the language model because I think it's more expressive. You can do more, and in a more compressed fashion. For synthesis, like a patch diagram can be super helpful. There's no question. And we come back to that, talking about Supercollider, which is not until like the latter half of the 90s. So I did a lot with Formula for many years, using Atari computers, using Macs. Then I was still using Formula when I did fugue states, which is actually maybe a piece that is explicitly tied to Tudor Muma. And fugue states, which has never been released, basically used two Mountain Hardware cards for DSP and a Eugen library that Phil Burke wrote. And the idea of the piece was to duplicated the processor that Gordon Muma designed for the Pepsi Pavilion. So there were 4 channels of that. But the idea of the piece was that everything was based on interpolation, so that I would define a set of tunings, but then you would never fully arrive at any tuning. You'd always be moving in hybrids between the tunings. And that was kind of the approach, which I for some reason, I was not really aware of Edges by Christian Wolff at that point. But Edges has that idea for improvisers that you don't play the notation, you play near it. And so that idea of organizing things in terms of interpolation of parameters, I find to be the most idiomatic for digital systems. Like that makes sense there. It's the thing you can do there that you really can't do easily in a purely analog framework.
Because of lack of precision?
Just because it's too hard. I mean, how are you going to interpolate 8 different control knobs at the same time? It's trivial on a computer. It's analog synthesizer, forget it. So and actually, I mean, just to gesture, so we just did they had this exhibition for the 100th anniversary of Tudor. And I did realization of dialects, and the way I did that realization was I wanted to keep the analog sound, but have that available. And I did it very simply in Supercollider. The only things you hear are triangle wave oscillators, noise generators, and filters. It totally sounds analog. It's all digital. But it then allowed me to move through material with that same approach. So it was sort of doing Tudor with a slightly different approach, but not, the thing is, with Tudor, the whole idea is you don't hear the knob turning. So that I respected completely. I mean, that's essential. I mean, that's like,
That's the piece.
I mean, or it's such a stylistic faux pas, in terms of his work that you wouldn't want to do it. Where fugue states, the idea is it's constantly doing that. So there's an element of that piece that actually is a response to Éliane in that idea, except instead of it being at a glacial pace, it's just that the entire sound object kind of morphs into, you end up someplace entirely different. Where with her, like in the electronic pieces, you have very much a sound object and then possibly one other sound object is introduced. And it's all internal to their character, how the piece emerges. So that's anyway, and all of that stuff is very hand coded. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
We've started unpacking this a little bit. I wanted to discuss generally kind of what your relationship to these digital platforms was, and your relationship to coding and computer music. So I think we can address Supercollider now.
Yeah. Okay. So
if you have more to say, then please do.
No. But I mean, to dive into that. So James McCartney, who wrote Supercollider and then made it freeware when he went to work for Apple, or made it a shareware project, he had written something called Pyrite, which was an external for Macs. There was a little list processing kernel. And it was completely amazing, I think, in that, to my mind, it resolved all the things that I found unpleasant in working with Macs. But the way it happened was I had this project I was going to do at ZKM, which involved these kind of quasi-robotic pointers. And I built them at Arizona State University Institute for Study in the Arts. And they were supposed to make me this control box for it. But I talked to the guy who was doing it, and I knew this was just not going to happen. And so what I had to do is, over a couple of weeks, like 3 weeks, figure out how to control, it seems it was 16 pointers. So the idea is you get a voltage for, left, right positioning, up and down positioning, and then you have to increment it. And the only way to do this was going to be in Macs. So it's like, oh my God. Because, the proliferation of stuff is a nightmare in Macs. Anyway, so somebody said, well, try Pyrite, downloaded Pyrite, had it done in a week. It's miraculous because it does lists. It had even closures. So you could even do a kind of homegrown object-oriented programming within it if you wanted to. I didn't need that for what I was doing. But the main thing is it allowed iterations. So once I have one channel, I have all the channels.
Right.
And it's all within a clean structure. And so that was a thing of beauty. I'd already started working with Supercollider at that point. Matt Rogalski.
And this is what years? This is like early 90s?
Oh, no, this is late 90s. This is like 97 beyond. So Matt Rogalski introduced me to Supercollider at it was probably the Tudor Memorial Rainforest that happened at Lincoln Center. So I got interested in that. And then I was actually touring with Cunningham Company at that point. And there was a concert in Austin. So I went and visited James McCartney just to find out about it. And then he had been very at work on, there was a thing called BOS at the time and had a big sound program he'd written for that. But anyway, then he moved back and made a new version of Supercollider 2. And then, subsequently, maybe 2 years later, started 3. Anyway, so I had him actually at Wesleyan, do a little residency while he was still working on that. We had conversations. One of the things in Formula is everything is done with routines, with coroutines. And he was avoiding coroutines, and I was arguing for them. And it took about 2 years, but I finally won. It's too nerdy a subject to get into in any detail. But for me, Supercollider had all of the good features of Formula and also did DSP. Part of that is, as an interpreted language, but with structure, you could code things interactively. Although actually at first you couldn't with Supercollider. What happened was that, okay, so just as this has been my mission in relation to computers. Like talking about the relationship is to make them fully interactive rather than to have a coding running dichotomy. And Supercollider originally had that, but what I noticed was lowercase letters of the alphabet are provided as variables, automatically, sort of global variables. So what that means is if I create an object and assign it to that letter, it persists. So once you have that, you can have a bunch of them. And now you start having an interactive system. And it hadn't occurred to James that that was possible. It was like, oh, yeah. And then he incorporated that into the system. There was a lively interaction at that point in terms of extending its capabilities in that particular way.
So I want to take one like sort of half side step here to kind of expand on this question. I think, like a kind of general concern of mine is what it is, kind of identifying what it is that electronic musicians are doing. That, I think there's a line sort of loosely from Tudor through Buchla and especially Surge to environments like Max and Supercollider, that, these are all platforms that erode the boundaries between composition, performance, and instrument or systems design.
Sure.
So yeah, I want to just like pose the question to you, like, how do you situate these practices? Do you think of live coding as, an extension or advancement of sort of traditional orthodox improvisation techniques, or is something different going on here? Is there like an epistemological rupture?
Well, I think of live coding really as a combination of a convenience and a training ground. What it in a way, it's a get out of jail free card, which is that it means that you can have something that's pretty well planned, have an idea, and actually, be able to try it on the fly if the environment is right. And so that gets it to a level of being improvisation. The fundamental difference, of course, is that we think of improvisation primarily within the highly trained kind of kinesthetic connection to instrument. So another thing that I'm very interested in these days is Catherine Hale's thought on cognition, and the idea that cognition is much faster than consciousness. And so part of developing technique on an instrument is developing the ability to play faster than you think, with greater accuracy than you can temporally think, right? So with a computer, when you're interacting with live coding, you're inherently, that's impossible because you have to type, right? But you can lock back in through various kinds of synchronization techniques. But it means that that kinesthetic relationship is lost, right? So you're playing chess. It's like a different game in that way. And I think that's just sort of intrinsic in any kind of electronic or electromechanical relationship where event is being generated. That goes back to Nancaro with player pianos. And so the difference is attenuated by the fact that most experience of music these days is through recording.
Okay.
And my own relation to recording has been, to avoid it.
Let's loop back to that. Like, I did want to ask the question, like, why you did sort of move away from recording, which I feel like you sort of half answered through
through
the fact
installation.
that you moved right.
But then
it was something it was directed by aesthetic concerns rather than maybe sort of concerns about media or concerns about kind of said medium social kind of social embeddedness, right?
Yeah, no. Look, we always live in compromised circumstances, so that doesn't interest me. It's like, well, nobody's going to be to blame for using an affordance. It seems to me that's silly. What you do with the affordance, you might be to blame for, right? But that's a different matter, right? So it shouldn't be like you're inherently disqualified because you put out a CD or something. That's silly.
Right.
But now I'm actually, I'm sort of, so another aspect of this is since I've been teaching at Wesleyan, my feeling is that the benefits I derive from that mean that I should think about how the position I find myself in can be for the benefit of the art, and that I shouldn't use that as a tool to push my own career because I'm getting too much benefit from it and it's too hard.
Okay,
So instead, it's been to do these other things, which is why I'm looking forward to retiring, because then I can push my own career. Which will happen soon. You wait.
We keep going kind of through kind of complex loops to get to the questions.
We're doing the weave, baby.
Yeah, we are. But so, I did want to ask about your kind of pedagogical practice at large. You've taught at Wesleyan for a long time.
40 years, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say in some capacity since the 80s. And,
yeah.
And in a
as
greater
an artist
capacity.
As an adjunct, and then as a tenured professor, yeah.
So, I wanted to, ask how you understand your role as a teacher.
Well, I think
it's something you started answering.
It shifts with becoming, like when I became a university professor, I viewed it as being really a fundamental shift. Like at that point, I have a responsibility to the care and feeding of the entire program.
Okay.
Right. And one of the things, I mean, this is something that comes naturally to me and drives me crazy about the vast majority of other humans, is it seems to me if you want to understand a situation, you have to understand it from the other perspectives involved. And most people don't. Right. And so in the case of the university situation, that's complex. Right. And so that's one piece of that. Another piece is I really like advising thesis projects, and I devote a lot of intellectual energy to kind of getting insight and really understanding the creative project of the person I'm working with and trying to expose additional possibilities and to, and I think more importantly, to expose additional understandings.
I'll say just real quick, having worked with you, pretty extensively in that capacity, you care about students' work in a way that very few teachers that I have ever had do.
Yeah, I think of that as a duty. I mean, that's like, and it's fun. I mean, the thing about it is,
right.
Okay, so back to Tudor for a second. In interviews, people would always be challenging him. Well, aren't you really making the piece when you realize these pieces? They say, no, never, because it's coming from somebody else's envisioning. I have this long, complicated argument we could go into later on or a different day about, so indeterminacy with Cage and Tudor is actually a program for reconciling virtuosity with Werktreuer. Okay, so Werktreuer, the tradition of you follow the notation exactly, compared to virtuosity, where I'm able to bring my virtuosity to bear and
right.
Further develop the musical idea. So those are two warring points of view in the first half of the 20th century. Tudor is trained in Werktreuer, but becomes, as a pianist, interested in virtuosity. And when you look at these interviews, for example, the famous piece of Stockhausen's Klavierstück 11, which is the huge notation, and you play where your eye lands. Tudor was furious because he had Stockhausen had talked to him about the compositional processes involved, and he was expecting to get a kind of meta notation from which he would develop a realization. And so there's this interview where he says, I was so shocked when I saw the rhythms were notated. Right, which just seems insane, right? Unless you understand this backstory, right? So that that whole relationship. Okay. Anyway, so back to teaching. So it's sort of an analogous situation where I get to think about a problem I would never think about in my own work. And so that's like really, you learn a lot from that. Like I think I would say with great confidence that having done all this teaching has made me a better composer. I'm clearer. I can catch myself, when you sort of lie to yourself. You're making something and you kind of,
Because you see people do it a lot.
Well, of course, yeah. And so you say, oh no. And so that's been that. But so I would say that so what happened, of course, and with all of that is everything shifted. I went to Berlin for a year in 99, 2000. And it was at that point that we created a kind of MA track in composition. So when I came back, I'd say that this is actually the pivotal moment now that I think about it, because then the first thing was how to make this really a program.
So prior to this, the Wesleyan program was just a program, right?
Yeah, well, it was the World Music Program, that idea.
Right.
And so primarily people were ethnomusicologists, and there'd be occasional composers. Wonderful people or incredible minds like Doug Kahn, right? Matt Rogowski. I mean, but at that point, because of Anthony, really, I mean, there's a steady stream of really wonderful people applying. It became really arguable we should create a program for this. But there's also the issue of the great respect, but still creative complexity of Alvin and Anthony. So I organized a symposium called Music in the, scare quotes, Free World, 1952 to 1970, that was trying to chart the parallel paths of African-American experimentalism through jazz and experimental music as we understand it. Because, and thinking 1970, because it's kind of the point of where, Anthony really, in fact, kind of embodies an important point of collision in that.
You're talking about Anthony Braxton here for listeners.
Who actually, played in the Philip Glass Ensemble for 6 months. And so that symposium kind of got to the end of it, and Alvin kind of admitted, well, yes, when you're doing those live electronic pieces, you're kind of improvising. I was sitting next to George Lewis, and I said, now we have a program. And that was it. I think I actually believe that was crucial to just, okay, now we understand what we're doing. And the beautiful thing was, I have to say, so for many years, it would be Alvin, Anthony, and I would be the examining committee for MA theses. And it was kind of bizarre that totally different humans, not talking about it at all necessarily, we would have the same ideas about the work. Like somebody would ask a question, oh yeah, that was a question I was going to ask. And it got to such a point of like, this was so predictable. I started telling people, okay, chances are you'll find that the three of us have very similar thoughts about your work. That might lead you to the mistake of thinking we might be right. Don't. So in installation, one thing which I have not pursued as much as I'd like to, basically, what also happened is like you start, like I was chairing repeated times and doing this and that. And so then it becomes really hard if you're going to do, because I want to do that in a very, very responsible way. It becomes hard with time. So I did this piece, Weather at 6. So this is, and the idea was of an installation that would run for a year and go through a gradual change over that year. And so it was in the context that they wanted something about, global warming. And this was early on, before this was a full discussion. But to my mind, this is like not the way to think about this, which is it's not about that specific subject. It's about belief. When do you decide things are strange?
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And so as kind of the way I did the piece was I recorded the carillon and then made, kind of resonant filter simulations of the carillon that would sound just like the carillon. Put speakers up in the carillon. I would play at 6, and it would start out, beginning as kind of a normal kind of carillon piece. And then over the year, it just got weirder and weirder in terms of further and further away from the articulation patterns of the carillon. At the same time, almost as a joke, the pitch patterning and patterns were all based on the weather on that day in relation to the weather across the year for 100 years.
Okay.
So I had to use Central Park because that's the only place where you had that data. That was largely a MacGuffin in that, to me, sure, okay. So there's this thing of, if you average everything, you can see a rise, but you don't notice that rise without the averaging. But of course, the averaging is not something you can perceive, right? And in reality, the way we experience this anyway is not from the temperature, but from how that changes the energy system of the air. And this was not about that at all. But really what it was about is, when do you decide that is not a carillon? And the idea that then it's sort of on the fringe of your attention, because carillon, oh yeah, carillon's happening. It is, so you can think that, in a sense, what the piece is about a moment of recognition that will happen at different times over the year for different listeners when they decide this is not right. Right. And that kind of a project interests me. That, of course, has a strong imprint of Max Neuhaus. I mean, so the Times Square piece, the idea of like when you observe its presence. This is different from that, just, in all sorts of technical ways. But the fundamental idea of a relationship to listening, which is about how you create something that somebody can decide to give their attention over to without prompting, is fundamental. And that has a certain kind of moral force to it, right? Which is to say, we are constantly insulating ourselves from the disagreeable in our daily experience and in our understanding of the world. And so anything that leads you to open to that, I view as being on some kind of fundamental neural wiring level a good thing.
Right. There's at least some latent political potential always there.
Simply in the act of giving attention, that's all it needs to be on a certain, in the long run.
And that seems to like harken back in a kind of embryonic form to some of the earlier pieces, your earliest pieces that you were describing.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's there, and of course it's there in the idea of all the different ways music can be. Like the Wesleyan thing. They are all very much intertwined.
So, looping back to kind of pedagogy, one thing that came up a few times, in the couple of years that I worked with you, was the kind of looming question of pedagogy as composition or compositional pedagogy. I think you brought up Cobra in this context, even.
Oh, I see. Sure. Well, that's the idea of these pieces. There's this small collection of pieces that end up being auto-training and kind of creating scenes. So in C, Cobra, Rainforest to a lesser degree, but certainly are I think good examples of that, where learning to do the piece actually ends up somehow leading people to want to make other pieces in that direction.
Right.
And so, you could think of this in like, so there's the term of participatory culture that was a big deal maybe 10 years ago. But that is relevant and maybe something of particular concern now because of the various legends we're being fed about machine learning, right?
The question there for me was, is there a way in which you see your own compositional, or sorry, your own pedagogical practice as a form of kind of meta composition, or
No,
even just kind of directly composition?
No, I think it's more about realization. Back to that idea, because when I'm working with somebody, I'm working from their center, right? So, but I mean, I think as realization, absolutely, that I will give specific suggestions or sometimes lures that I think will lead to a more productive relationship with the material in one way or another, or whatever it is they're doing. I mean, and that is completely mercurial. There's no way to theorize it because it's except in the specifics of that person's creative project, right? And what is needed is a very difficult judgment call. Like sometimes people just need to be left alone. Right. Sometimes they really need an intervention, and it's not obvious, much of the time. So that's a whole thing. Now, maybe I'll mention Bologna Times, which is this installation I did a couple years ago, which is sort of the launch of my interest in wave field used indirectly. So the idea is, okay, so wave field installations, right? Typically the speakers are around the house. And because there's this theorem that if you define the waveform there, you define everything inside that fantasy. Well, although I haven't heard recent installations, when I've heard that, like say in Germany, the sound is never really, the illusion is very impressive, but the raw sound has not been that attractive to me. It's kind of limited in bandwidth. But I'm very interested in steering sound and reflecting it, because then the apparent source gets large. You can sort of expand and contract the size of the sound, if I can put it that way, by how you steer, like whether you're forming a parallel beam or you're narrowing it or widening it. And so anyway, so I was doing this project, and originally it was going to be all about Dahlgren, the sci-fi novel, which I like quite a lot. But this was right at the time of various trials around January 6th. And the Danny Rodriguez FBI interview came out. And I became quite obsessed with this because it was so interesting how my sense of the people involved, 2 FBI agents, the third is there for a moment, and Rodriguez, how it shifts over the 3 hours. Like at first, of course, he was tasing a cop and, doing a whole bunch of terrible stuff. And so you're inclined, but he's a true believer, and there's a kind of innocence to that. And of course, the FBI agents are there being, manipulative in the way you would in an interrogation. And so I got very interested in the idea of, well, is there a way to watch this? How can it be possible to see it in that way? See it as these humans succeeding and failing simultaneously, and not separate from the politics of the moment, in a sense. And so, and part of what I was very interested in with Rodriguez is this idea of like hearing the call, right? That he's committed, right? So the idea of the sound coming from anywhere, like the burning bush, right? That was interesting to me. And what I actually ended up doing in the installation is having telephones where there are 2 telephones that will ring, but the ringtone is normally like 20 hertz, but that's controllable. So what happens is they speed it up, and it's like the telephone gets hysterical. So like the telephone becomes angry, right? Then the sound world of the piece involves both the kind of electronic textures that are really doing the spatial stuff, and then different fragments from the interview that are salient in various ways. And those are presented in kind of granular fragmentation. So you can kind of make it out, but not completely. But there's a third telephone that if you pick it up, between the outside sound and the inside sound, you get everything. So it's sort of setting up these relationships of that sort. But the hardest thing was, well, okay, how to make the, first of all, my rule of thumb for installation is you need to do the whole thing in 15 minutes. It's got to be like 15 minutes is enough. You can't expect any more than that, and even that's hard.
Right.
So the problem was, and the interview was like 3 hours. So what I ended up finding what I would do is, and also the video is like almost unwatchable. It's essentially a security camera on like a little office. But what I found was, what I do is jump to a position, then play in reverse half speed, and then jump back to that position. So you sort of see that, and those then become these gestures that you're sort of seeing, and then it's jumping through, moving through the entire 3 hours. And, you know, like a thing like, so there's kind of a cycle for the duration of the backwards clips that phases. So there's like 9 durations, but only 7 events are used for each new breakpoint in the video. So that shifts. So, and so by basically having that kind of visual thing that has its intrinsic interest because of the gesticulations that are being caught, that then makes that watchable. Then you get the kind of unfolding of things like, you know, like there's Miranda, there's phatic communication, there's moments where Rodriguez really reveals himself, moments when the FBI agents reveal themselves. So those sort of emerge. And that's all kind of on a cycle that it's varying within the cycle, but the cycle is pretty strict. And so that piece, but the thing that was nice is you walk into this room, there's a video projection, there's a couple of phones, there's no loudspeakers that you see. Because loudspeakers are just a little line of small speakers, just with a little, you know, piece of fiberglass as a baffle, and the sound is coming from anywhere. So that, for the poetry of that installation, was great. But the fundamental technique of diffusing the sound in that way, I think, has lots of legs. I did another piece with it with 4 instruments, 2 winds, 2 strings, because it also means, like, there's always a thing, if you have electronics and instruments, speakers project differently than instruments. So what? You end up amplifying the instruments. I wanted to not amplify the instruments. And this makes that work because the sound, it just doesn't have that same penetration that it does from a speaker, but it still has presence. So it's just more like an instrument in a funny way. I mean, just think about it, like a speaker is there, it's this piston pushing in a unidirectional way, an instrument is expanding and contracting. There's all sorts of compromise in terms of how the wavefront is made. And I think that's something I'm very interested in just like a pure sound fashion. Thing about it is it's something that's essentially it has to be chamber music. I mean, the whole point is you're hearing instruments directly with the electronic sound. So that's kind of that whole project. And I'd say, I mean, the most recent thing I did, of course, was with just the realization of dialects, just like last month. And now I'm kind of looking both at a piece that follows up on fugue states and a piece that follows up on the linear predictive zoo. I'm kind of going back to those at the moment. That's kind of where my thoughts are.
I did want to get to some general questions maybe quickly about Tudor, but before that, sure. I wanted to address, we got a couple mail-in questions from some very high-profile, esteemed colleagues. Emma mistily asked the question of what does a composer do and why music?
Okay, wait a minute. What does a composer do? A composer creates a situation where music happens. And that they conceive of that situation in material terms, typically. Although the material might not be primarily sound material. Like, so for example, I mean, back to Cobra, right? Cobra is really about intervening in groupings of improvising musicians. It's based on the premise that, well, free improvisation is great, but we end up doing the same thing. So we want to have a way to interrupt those habits, right? So there's no idea about sound there. There's a complete awareness of a kind of genres of improvisation. But the whole point is there isn't, and that's what makes it. So you have to be able to include a piece like that in your understanding of composition, even if that's become folk music. I mean, Zorn would pretty much say that it's like totally out of his control as a piece.
Right.
And then why music? I'm not sure if that's applied to me or applied to the world or what. I
think you can answer that in the context of the previous question. I think might be the most immediately illuminating.
No. So there's some simple arguments to make here. So when it comes to sound, we have certain capabilities that we don't have in other senses. Our ability to sense proportion is far more accurate and extensive than it is for vision with distance, for example. And so that ability to perceive proportion ends up generating this space of activity with pitch, right? That isn't duplicated in other sense modalities. And then it also has this immediate connection to spoken word. So if you think about it, what happens is in spoken word, we've got consonants and vowels. Consonants, okay, various genres, but basically consonants are like percussion, right? Yeah. And you could think of, like Jim Tenney, 3 Indigenous Songs or some piece like that, which literalizes that. But so there's always a kind of underlying, a sublimated presence of vocalization in concert music until the advent of recording.
Right.
And now that shifts. And now we're into a period of alternative selves. Like you hear that in pop music, even like extensive processing of the voice in ways to render it, really reconfigure things, while at the same time having a very strong sense of the fundamental pop modality of confession or self-expression, which say would be very different in experimental music, where that's really not the point. But so that's everywhere. I mean, maybe this moment I can trot out Kate Hales for a couple of minutes, which is maybe, and this is something that I'm very interested in. So, she has this beautiful argument that cognition, and she has this very clever definition of cognition, has sort of an adaptive system that connects to meaning. Takes something and connects it to meaning. So very ambiguous about what that would be. But her idea is like this extends from all life forms. Like plants, you can certainly argue, have a cognitive capacities. They can adapt to circumstances. You don't need to endow them with consciousness to have that. Right. And technologies. So, like right now, all this nonsense with AI and general artificial intelligence. To me, general artificial intelligence seems like a fundamentally authoritarian fantasy. Large language models are not going to get us there, and the motivations underlying identifying with that possibility on the part of these very bright people are completely under-considered. Because what happens there is there's a parasitic authority that you're asserting by asserting this thing. If you're the person who makes it, right? I mean, so, there's a lot there that strikes me as craziness. But I think Hale's configuration of that kind of resolves it very neatly. It's definitely a cognitive system. Right. And it can definitely have cognitive capacities that far exceed human. That's already the case for the computer. That's no big deal. What we're really talking about here is politics. We're talking about the extent to which that cognitive capacity can control our environment, right? And so it's not really an engineering question or even a philosophical question. It's a political question. So it's philosophical in that sense, but weirdly, we're not there. So I'm very interested in Hale's construction because it seems to have the possibility of being kind of an antidote to some of that. But here's the other reason. So part of her rap is, so cognition is fast, consciousness is slow, right? And, we've all seen the basketball being passed around with the guy in the monkey suit walking through, and we don't see the monkey suit, right? So this is, part of her argument for, so non-conscious cognition affects consciousness. So our relationship between the cognitive mechanisms that we have at our disposal and what we think, what we experience is ductile, manipulable, and not well understood. So that's all kind of cool. Now, when I read this and I start thinking about the history of post-war experimentalism, I think, oh, well, actually, I would argue there was a cognitive turn. One way you can find this is, so go back to 433. Okay, so 433, when it's first done, is this idea of the highest work is no work. And so it becomes about self-abnegation, really, that David Tudor, this great pianist, sits down and closes the lid and observes. But the moment you do it, it stops being about performance and starts being about music as a way of listening. That for the listener, that means I open my attention out to whatever happens to be happening. Okay, so it's like Mission Impossible, the message, the order to self-destructs. The piece as it was made kind of vanishes into this other understanding. And this other understanding then has a deep connection to the cognitive arguments in that it becomes about what your attention can discover. So the limits of cultural intelligibility come in sort of a Rancière's sense, right? So the idea that there are these things that we just don't think about in terms of the arts. The bourgeoisie in the 19th century, and then you have Flaubert. Okay, so that project, that is the project of experimentalism for a long time. I mean, so you can kind of go through, and even Cage is pretty explicit about this with Lamont Young, saying he's doing something very different from me, but it's completely in the same direction. Having a single sound sustained, and then you discover your hearing changes. That's explicitly like a testo, right? I mean, that's explicitly cognitive in that sense, right? That you become aware of those processes. But what it fits into is this kind of larger framework of the way I've put it in the past is you take any opposition you can think of and think, well, so this is like the Greimas semiotic squares. So you have A and B, and you think, so for example, you can think of noise and music. You can think of thing that's not music and the thing that's not noise and create a circulation. But what you do instead in music is take that opposition, you find this alternative, the thing that's missing, and start making pieces. So you can think of like Pauline Oliveros' corporeality as part of listening, as part of performance. The denied presence of the body becomes part of the framework for the sonic meditations and so forth and so on, right? I mean, so that's an example. Repetition, stasis through repetition with Terry Riley, the drone, spatiality of sound, and the acoustics of sound as generative of the hearing experience in Alvin's work, and so forth and so on. So there's kind of, it seems to me there's a strong connection there. And it becomes more explicit. Like Cage writes, the thing to do with this music is be empty-headed but alert. Well, that's describing cognition in Hale's terms. And so the idea of imagining a kind of pure cognitive state, right, would be one way of thinking of that, which seems impossible. Now, Tudor says the challenge here is I have to be able to play and completely shed any associations with the moment I've played to prepare for the next moment. And learning to do this enabled me to be free for a whole hour at a time, is how he describes it for the music of changes, right? And interestingly, by the way, part of how he does this, he says, is through Artaud's idea in effective athleticism of control of the breath. But Artaud thinks of that as you control the breath to induce affect in the performer without a text. Where Tudor's idea is you use breath to release yourself from an obligation that affect the moment it's happened. Okay, so all of that exists within this domain that Hales is talking about, which is essentially what is intuition might mean actually that you're accepting input from cognitive mechanisms that you normally don't, cognitive cues. And all of that seems so this seems to be like a very nice close thing. She actually wrote a paper on Bill Viola and Namjoon Pike talking about this in terms of radical slowness with the late Viola pieces and kind of the speed of information superhighway with so many things happening at once. But I think it's like this is sort of a deeper version of it. And it also then becomes a way of revalorizing things that, like, say, students have a hard time with, like acquiring instrumental skill, these things that require rote training, we resist because we've been taught that we should, that's uncritical, right? Right. That thought is of greater value, right? And so it's this question of, well, okay, yeah, with these new information affordances, does this mean we need to, or we will discover differing relations to our cognitive capacities? Like, we don't care about memory palaces anymore, but that was a big deal in 1500,
Right?
And for obvious reasons. We have our phones. And okay, back to Hales. So she's got this concept of a cognitive assemblage, which is like, okay, so we don't need to, and that already exists. Gut biome as an example, for example. So basically, it turns into a kind of radical embeddedness of the self, that the self is never just a self. The self is always in assemblage of other things. Back to Cage and Tudor, that's that 50s partnership that breaks down in 1962. It's kind of a cognitive assemblage in that Cage's job is to open up the personality of David Tudor through a notation that allows him to be in touch with his virtuosity. Tudor's job is to render that piece, to realize that piece as an actual sounding presence. So once that breaks down, so that's the uniqueness of that relationship. And then once it breaks down, you can see how destabilizing that is. So in embracing the possibility of cognitive assemblage, I think it also helps give a warning about how to do that, or considering what happens if you lose the connection as well. So anyway, so that interests me because it gives me an entirely different way of thinking about the music of the last 70 years.
Right.
And you can see where cognition comes in and becomes central, and then where it goes out.
So yeah, there's a lot to process there. I have a lot of thoughts, most of which are like quarter formed.
Sure.
But I guess to kind of summarize for listeners' sake, you're sort of situating the 20th century American experimental boom blossoming as a kind of proto cognitive turn.
Yes, because you're to the extent that you're resisting utilizing familiar musical languages.
Right.
So the work,
and this is to sort of bring forth awareness of these underlying cognitive processes.
Well, no. I mean, they're not thinking of it in those terms. That's a retrospective.
No. Right. No, exactly. Of course. This is your kind of revision.
Yeah, exactly. It's a rereading of it. Rereading. Yes. Because of course, instead, it's very funny, right? It's couched in these completely kind of psychological terms of like silencing the ego, right? In Cage's case.
Right.
And that this way of thinking about it, then I think also helps understand, for example, the very real pleasures soundscape recorders get from recording soundscapes. I mean, there's other stuff here that I haven't really developed a thought on. I'm kind of working on this idea right now, which is why I want to talk about it.
No. I mean, it's fascinating, and there's a whole lot there for sure.
And the piece here is that it's absolutely the case that like all of these ideas kind of end up requiring recording. They require the externalization of something close to the heard event to make it repeatable.
Right. Oh, so in this case, the recorder kind of enters in as a sort of objective third or fourth party or something.
Well, or a Madeline I mean, it can also be that you listen to the recording
Right,
you made,
right,
and you
okay,
recall,
like a Proustian Madeline.
yeah, exactly.
Yes.
That you recall the entirety of that experience, right?
Okay.
And I mean, so for example, think about people whose job it was to recognize what had been sampled for copyright billing purposes. No, I mean, like, it's a really particular, instant recognition. That recognition, it seems to me, is not happening. It's happening almost at a cognitive level.
Yeah.
I mean, or what happens, that will get you very close, and then you do a little more analysis to nail it down.
Right.
So that's an example, possibly, of an alternate cognitive practice. So this, like, for example, this gets me interested in sports science, right? Because that's the same thing. I mean, any kind of time-based performance has to be faster than consciousness.
Maybe just a real quick summary of, Wesleyan is home to the Tudor archive, which is a vast collection of his, unusual hand-built instruments. I wanted, you've talked about this a good bit so far, but
well, yeah, let me
maybe
just
a quick,
yeah. Okay, so quick overview. Because it also includes David Behrman's materials, Alvin's materials, a few things of Gordon Muma and Richard Lehrman's materials, and there is a way in which that is an interesting composite of a set of distinct responses to a shared moment of technological change in the 60s. And so thinking about it now, this is why I kind of like talking about Hales, is it's like thinking about, well, okay, what can we derive from that might help us in thinking about the current situation, right? I mean, like that's another way of imagining that. I should give a special shout out to Michael Johnson, who just has incredible.
We definitely would love to try to get Michael on.
Oh, I'm sure.
On the podcast
You should.
at some point,
I mean, because he's the one who I think has the most intimate understanding of the idiosyncrasies of individual Tudor boxes when they're built incorrectly, but that leads to a behavior, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that really, I mean, I think the theme there is this person with really amazing ears kind of discovering this way of working. Is really very, very special. One of the huge difficulties, of course, with this is that electronics basically, they evaporate in a sense. Like, so the stability of this that's not stable. I mean, like we did a version of Run Through of David Behrman with the original instruments. It was like flying an airplane with 3 engines off. I mean, it was hard. And so it's sort of, I mean, I think of it as it's like a puzzle sitting there for the right addicts. And that it's not really a general tool. Now, I should mention the show that Bowerbird did in Philadelphia. Michael arranged the boxes, and it was actually quite beautiful because
this is a recent Tudor retrospective.
Yeah, exactly.
That happened in Philadelphia,
where the Dialects performance was done, and Michael did Untitled.
Yeah.
And also Pulsars. And so by opening the boxes and seeing their handmade quality, I think for viewers, what it allows you to do is see the extent of attention at work. and that is a pretty palpable gallery experience. So it's a way of thinking about how, there's things that just, it doesn't make sense. They can't be represented or encountered in any kind of satisfactory way in an exhibition format, but other important aspects of it can. I think that's
right.
Yeah.
I mean, showing the schematics is not going to be very rewarding or illustrative for most people. So yeah, and even in a sense, even in a sense, realizing the music itself may be or is illustrative in a different way.
Well, right, because the other problem here is we're hearing it with entirely different ears. I mean, we've been trained by the last 40 years of music, so the kind of unprecedented nature of the sound, the indigestibility of that is, it becomes an advantage to historicizing it because it gets stabilized. But and I think that's just an inescapable property of human development. So that's all fine, but it's worth recalling, and it's why, particularly with these pieces or with that whole body of work, which is so much about pushing against the limits of your experience. The idea of new realizations, whether they are, whether they're imagined as separate pieces that are responsive to a particular idea, or as realizations of a piece where there's the kind of contractual nature of a notation that you can work from. I think that's really worthwhile and sort of underdone. We end up converging towards authenticity because that's stable. And it's also possibly simply because it's so marginal in terms of broader culture that you need to take your authority where you can get it. But that these are actual fundamental challenges and problems for the art. I mean, which is to say, we shouldn't be just in that business. At the same time, it's really not satisfactory to think, you make some sounds that are similar and you're doing a response to Tudor. That's the surface. And so that's those become interesting and difficult issues. Yeah.
There's two questions that we should at least just get a quick nod to before we wrap. One is like the kind of overarching structuring question that this podcast aims to investigate is sort of how do our guests function under capitalism as artists? How do they make things work on a kind of pragmatic level? And these responses may be practical, poetic, philosophical. Just some quick ruminations on that from yourself, Ron, would be
well. I mean, for the last 20 years, a bunch of it has been by teaching, right? And that now, and so I make sort of intermittently, and now I'm kind of done with that. I'm ready to really be making. I'm sort of kind of that's sort of the current project, and so that's why I envision departing from teaching in the next couple of years. That I don't think it's fair from my. This is very personal because it's not true for others, and that's totally fine. But for me, it's kind of like I don't want to pretend to be teaching in order to work.
Right. Well, no, I mean, I think like there's something that strikes me about your approach to your art and practice, and your approach to teaching. That I mean, I guess you have reconciled this by placing the primacy on teaching.
Yeah,
but that you have a lot of kind of Daniel Fishkin, I think it was once referred to you to me as you are one of the last great electronic music anarchists. And I think there's there is something to that. That there was this generation of people who approached their practice in this very, very anarchic and very rigorously DIY way that found unstable homes within academia.
Right. Yeah.
You're thinking of Serge. Yeah, it was so. It also, like Richard Teitelbaum and Bob Bilecki, who I both studied with, were like those are people who, in certain regards, maybe shouldn't have been teaching, and certainly wouldn't cut it in kind of contemporary like academic the contemporary academic landscape.
Right.
You have managed to navigate that very successfully. But what I kind of I am gleaning is that has come at the expense of your own kind of artistic expression.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's complicated because we have to distinguish the teaching from the institutional position.
Okay.
Right? Because the teaching has been the nourishment. The
Right.
I mean, so it's not fair to think of that as some kind of sacrifice. It's like it's delicious, but it's okay. We know about the problems of survival, and my sense of that as a kind of eco politics is I enjoy the benefits of a very comfy ecological niche, so I should use that for greater good. I mean, and that I've always thought. I mean, that has been just like a fundamental premise.
No, I think that's really beautiful and unfortunately relatively rare. So yeah, that's kudos to you. That's
thank you.
Spectacular.
Okay, you got another question?
We had one more mail-in question from Sam Boston.
Yeah, that's your whole audience. Hi, Sam. I am.
No. Our audience is a little bigger than that, but they were two people who I gave them a heads up that you were going to be guesting. So Sam asks, first, what is the most confusing thing that you've encountered in the past month? And second, how does one sober and quiet the mind, thus making it susceptible to divine influences?
Okay, let's see. So what's the most confusing? I'm not finding an answer for that one.
Maybe it was this question.
Well, possibly. No. In that actually, it hasn't been a period of great confusion the last month.
Wow. Lucky you.
I mean, I suppose you could say, certainly any sense of a prognosis for where things will be on the broader level in 6 months or even a month. I mean, there's that thing, but that's a boring version of confusion.
Right.
And then as far as sobering and quieting the mind, I mean, actually what I would say is it's, rather than thinking of it that way, it's the giving the fullness of finding a way to give the fullness of your intention to something. That if you're attending to something completely, that sobers and quiets the mind. And so that could be soldering, that could be playing the piano, that could be, hacking, that could be a million different things. And the problem is distinguishing that from things that occupy your attention through distraction.
Sure.
Right. So those are complementary versions where you're completely engrossed, but it's not that you are actively giving your attention. Your attention is being taken from you.
Yeah. I mean, all the obvious examples, Instagram, etc.
Yeah. So that would be. I think that's an actual answer to the second question.